Here now is Dr. Ridpath.
Now today I want to make the transition from all of the background influences on Marx to some points with regards to the fundamentals of Marx's philosophical outlook. The payoff will be next time. By payoff I mean, how does all of this tie into what you're all familiar with, which is that Marx advocated a violent revolution to overthrow capitalism and establish communism. And you will see that connection next time. Just to remind you of what we had covered, the best place for you to review that material is in the handout on page 11, the summary of Hegel, where I have mentioned 11 different notions in Hegel, 7 of which Marx accepts. That there is a historical struggle, that it is occurring here on earth, that it is dialectical, that struggle or tension is crucial to the advance of history, that freedom involves transcending the particular through union with the universal, and that philosophical ideas are not powerful causal agents. The Owl of Minerva quote illustrated that. That the end is to be achieved at any cost, and that the true essence is hidden or denied. But that Marx changes, essentially what he changes is Hegel's idealism. He also changes Hegel's notion as to in what collective should we participate in order for us to eventually achieve the end of alienation. Whereas Hegel advocates a subsuming of ourselves into the state, we'll see Marx advocates subsuming ourselves into the species or into humanity. Now the transition from Hegel to Marx, which is essentially a transition from idealism to materialism, takes place when Marx is at the University of Berlin and comes to read Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach was a member of the young Hegelian group there. And as I told you last time, in the face of what Hegel had done, the debate was on as to whether or not there was anything left to do, or to just sit quietly and wait for the absolute to realize its purposes had been achieved, and therefore for history to come to an end. Now there was a group that said, no, there is more to do. And specifically, if we could apply Hegel's method to his own thought, if we could turn onto Hegel the approach that Hegel had taken and apply one of Hegel's fundamental insights to Hegel himself, we would come to see that there is a truth hidden underneath Hegel's thoughts. To say what it is that is hidden in Hegel and what is covering up the truth that is hidden in Hegel. What is the kernel of truth contained within Hegel's grand metaphysical fantasy? What is this truth which we can use in order to transcend Hegel himself and arrive at what is in fact the real truth? This is the question they took upon themselves. The young Hegelians were referring to Hegel as a philosophical Moses, as the man who was leading them out of the desert, out of the illusions, and in the direction of truth, but that there was in Hegel some grand fantasy which hid the truth, within which the truth was contained. That Hegel had a correct method to teach us, disguised within a great metaphysical fantasy. The key, they thought, which was to be found in Hegel, was shown to them by a work entitled The Life of Jesus by David Strauss, a member of the young Hegelian group. Strauss had attacked Hegel's idealism. Strauss had attacked Hegel on the grounds that Hegel was in the end ultimately proposing a duality between man and God. And Strauss took issue with that. In fact, Strauss said, was not the case that man is something that God has to overcome, as Hegel had put it. Hegel had seen that it was God versus man, God versus everything God had created, God versus objectivity itself. Hegel had put it that what we seek is for God to come to realize that there is nothing beyond God. In essence, God is attacking objectivity itself. Strauss is arguing that this is not the case, and therefore the young Hegelians set out at the first, remaining loyal to Christianity, but trying to shift attention to a kind of earlier primitive life which the Christians were living, and they therefore presented Jesus as a union between God and man. The idea here is that there is no fundamental duality, and that the idea of fundamental duality in Hegel is the idea that has to be overcome. It is not the case that man is an alienated God. It is, in fact, the case that God could very well be alienated man. That we are making a mistake in this fundamental duality that Hegel put forward, that Christianity put forward, between man and God. This mistake is the notion that there is a fundamental opposition between these two. The young Hegelians were seeking to present the idea that it is not God struggling against the objective world in order to achieve his own self-awareness. It is not God that is seeking to discover his essence, it is humanity that is seeking to discover or to achieve its essence. It is, if you like, mankind seeking its own divinity. It is the union of mankind with the essence of man which lies within us, and which we are being prevented from experiencing by the grand Christian Hegelian duality. So, with this, Ludwig Feuerbach writes his work on Christianity, and this work elated Marx. He was excited about it. He says Feuerbach has broken the Hegelian spell, that Feuerbach is the purgatory of our time. In other words, you have to go through it. And making a play on the name Feuerbach, he said Feuerbach is the brook of fire that we all have to cross in order to arrive at the truth. So, Feuerbach, following Strauss, had taken up the view that the fundamental error that we are making and that Hegel is encouraging is that we are giving away our humanity in the creation of what they called the God illusion. That God is an illusion. God is not the real truth. It is something we are creating. It is a fantasy which we are creating. And we are giving away to God all of the things which are actually potentially good and admirable about man, leaving nothing for ourselves. We are casting out our essential nature, if you like, and our essential worth into the supernatural, leaving ourselves impoverished and alienated from our own true essence. And therefore, quote number 3, Feuerbach writes, the impoverishing of the real world and the enriching of God is one act. Most notably, Feuerbach observes, we are giving God the characteristic of being the grand producer. God produces the material world. That's an act of production without parallel. And in fact, Feuerbach, influenced by the utopian socialists, believe that in production lies the essence of humanity. So we are giving away our deepest essence by, in a sense, allowing God to be the producer, in a sense, emptying ourselves of the regard for we as the producer. So Feuerbach says of Hegel's philosophy, in particular his metaphysics, that Hegel is teaching us to love the wrong thing, and in that, thus, to hate ourselves. In fact, Feuerbach says that Hegel's metaphysics is, quote, esoteric psychology, end of quote, which means that Hegel's metaphysics is in fact a grand fantasy which seems to be metaphysics, but that the truth that it contains is actually a psychological truth. That this is, if you like, the hidden kernel of truth within Hegel, says Feuerbach. The truth, Feuerbach tells us, quote, is not mystical, but anthropological. And what is that truth? The truth is that if we look at the history of the human race, let alone if we read the utopian socialists, we will find out that the essence of man lies in productive work. And the reclaiming of our essence, which is the purpose of history, lies in changing the conditions and constraints under which we work. But how are we to do this? Now, this is an insight that this is what is required, is an insight that Marx accepts completely. But how are we to do this? Feuerbach, having read Fourier, tells us that we have to do, first of all, what we have to do is switch our love from God to mankind, to the species. So it's fundamentally a psychological act, switching an emotion to a different location, taking it away from the object God and addressing it to humanity. And guided by this love, he then believes that we will, if we would change our object of affections, that's important, change our object of affections, we would then see that the way for us to enter into work is communally. And he was an advocate of communism, which meant we all cooperate in our act of production. That we work for that which we love, which is mankind. We work for the benefit of all. And that when we recognize that this is the way for our essence which is essentially to be found in productive work, to come out, we will actually have overcome, if you like, this Hegelian duality, which Hegel has encouraged us to accept, and which, by overcoming, we will reunite man with his essence. This is the ultimate goal, to reunite man in a unity with his actual essence. Now, I observe that it is Feuerbach who says that the impoverishing of the real world and the enriching of God is one act, by which he means that to enrich God and, for example, to give to God the virtue of being the productive one, the producer, by which mankind therefore becomes deficient or inferior in his productive acts, is one of the ways in which we give all of our virtues to God and leave nothing for ourselves on the basis of which to love ourselves. Now, Feuerbach put this in this abstract form, that the impoverishing of the real world and the enriching of God is one act done through religion. But that's a very abstract observation. As we shall see later, it is not too many steps down the conceptual level to a more concrete form of this, where we can say that the impoverishing of the worker and the enriching of the capitalist is one act. This, of course, is Marx's version. So when Marx joined the young Hegelians in Berlin, it was because he was drawn to this notion, first of all, that the goal is to, if you like, make actual the humanity which is potential within us, and that the place for this to happen is here on earth. So these are the questions which drove him in his philosophical outlook, and the question becomes, what do we have to do in order to achieve our own divinity? Divinity meaning a unity, the overcoming of a duality. The goal then is to achieve unity, to transcend the dualism that we are caught up in. So this is the key to Marx's famous expression that what we have to do is realize philosophy. Or another way he put it is what we have to do is make the world more philosophical. Now this might surprise you, because if you read this, you might think, what is Marx saying that for? He doesn't mean we have to have more philosophers, because they're just exponents of rationalizations. What he means is we have to change the material world in order for it to allow for the goal, the achievement of humanity, which philosophy has discovered. So he's not talking about more philosophers, he's talking about action here. But that's what he means when he says we have to make the world more philosophical, meaning changing the real world so that the goal, divinity or unity, if you like, which philosophy has discovered, can be realized. And thus, his famous 11th thesis on Feuerbach, which is on his tombstone. He wrote a little, just a few pages, theses on Feuerbach. And this is what was chosen to capture what he was saying by Engels most thoroughly. I wanted to just tell you, when Harry Binswanger and I were in East Berlin, we went over there when the wall was coming down, and we were roaming around East Berlin, came across this impressive looking building, which we didn't know what it was. We couldn't read anything on the outside to tell, but we were just roaming, and we roamed, so let's go in there. And we go in there, and we walk in, there's this dark marble foyer, big foyer with steps going up each side, gold railings going up like that, and a dark marble wall in front of us, and gold letters carved into the wall in German. And Harry's certainly better than I am with German, and I'm sitting there, I'm slowly trying to get, what is that, you know? And Harry starts translating, and it's the 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Right in the entranceway to the University of Berlin, and up at the top of the stairs is this huge bust of Karl Marx. What is the 11th thesis on Feuerbach? It is, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in different ways. The point is to change it. The owl of Minerva takes flight only after the shadows of evening are fallen. So we have to get busy with our daylight activity, which is to change the world materially. So Marx then takes his start from Feuerbach and says that what we really have to do is understand that we need to focus ourselves here on this earth. We need to get away from Hegelian idealism, but we need to do one more thing. And in another famous phrase of Marx, he says we must realize, because what Feuerbach has said with regards to the Hegelian mysticism is Feuerbach says that is what he called holy alienation, H-O-L-Y, holy alienation. So Marx makes the famous phrase, there are unholy forms of alienation. Feuerbach didn't get it all. He has a small part of it, and we shall see Marx referred to religion as the opiate of the masses, but Marx is making a much, in his mind, much deeper observation, saying this is just a surface manifestation of a more deeper underlying alienating process. And that deeper process is material. It is in the economic conditions under which we work. What we have to do is not change our focus of our love, but change the circumstances under which we work. That is the key, the source of alienation. The economic circumstances under which we work. Marx says Hegels Metaphysics is not esoteric psychology, which is what Feuerbach says. Marx says Hegels Metaphysics is esoteric economics. That the truth, the rational kernel inside Hegel captures the duality which is to be overcome, which is the duality between the owner and the non-owner in the economic realm. The owner of the means of production and the non-owner. We have to transcend it. That's the source of classes, economic classes, the owners and the non-owners. And the source of the tension in history is the stress between economic classes. In a sense, in essence, to overcome this duality, which is Marx's ultimate project, is to end economic classes. That's because economic classes is the source of conflict. To overcome this, of course, we need to abolish private property. And that, therefore, means that we need communism. Now, I want to make some comments on some fundamental philosophical notions connected with Marxism. just to show you that Marx was a materialist, that Marx was an advocate of dialectics, what he had, just very briefly, what he had to say about some fundamental philosophical questions to set the stage for next time, where we see this philosophical framework, which has come to be called dialectical materialism, to see how it pays off in terms of his analysis of social history, which is what all this is really forming up the basis for. What we're leading up to here is the most general philosophical view within which Marx can say, if certain things are true of all reality, then they're true of social history too. And if they're true of social history in general, they're true of our particular era in social history, which is capitalism. And therefore, if that's the case, there are deterministic laws at work in capitalism. If I could show you what they are, you will see capitalism is doomed, and that the achievement of humanity is at hand. So all of this is focusing down onto that ultimate explanation. So let us just dabble here a little bit with basic Marxist metaphysics and epistemology. In 1843, Engels, not having yet met Marx, but he had read him, wrote, quote, "The philosophical efforts of the German nation from Kant through Hegel and including a Dr. Marx are all leading logically to one end result, communism." End of quote. Now this is, in fact, an accurate prediction. I want to show you some issues in fundamental philosophy here as a background to Marx's analysis of social history. The first point I want to make has to do with the relative significance of metaphysics and epistemology. As you all know, in objectivism, metaphysics is not a big subject. It's not regarded as an enormously complex subject. It is regarded as an application of common sense, in the sense of capturing an abstract form of certain things which are available to us in common sense form. So that Leonard Peikoff, in his book, writes, in page 37, quote, "Metaphysics in the objectivist viewpoint is a highly delimited subject. In essence, it identifies only the fact of existence, along with the corollaries of this fact. The subject does not study particular existence or undertake to guide men in the achievement of a goal. Metaphysics basically amounts to, there is a reality, the constituent elements of reality, the primary constituents are entities, not relationships or processes. Existence is identity, contradictions don't exist. Causality pertains, senses are valid, there is volition." And that would sum up, essentially, the objectivist metaphysics. Now, there's one more point I'd like to add, two more points to the objectivist metaphysics. First of all, metaphysics does not try to usurp science and offer ultimate explanations for the inner workings of particulars or the macro workings, or let alone purposes, of reality. And that ties in with the fact, with the objectivist view of cosmology, that much of what it passes for cosmology is out as actual rational knowledge at all. That cosmology is, and most philosophers have engaged in it, including Hegel and including Marx and Engels, is what Nietzsche referred to as ontomythology. It's all a fanciful ultimate explanation at a cosmic level, actually at a level where there are no explanations. As Leonard Peikoff was just saying the other day, there's certain things you have to live with. Consciousness has identity, and that has implications. Well, now the point I just want to leave you with is that in Marxism, the point is that metaphysics is a big, big deal. Now, of course, you know in objectivism, it's epistemology is the big deal. And that it's particularly method, which is crucial to everything. That the discovery of the rational method is the key to everything, including a kind of metaphysics that you would be open to. And in Marxism, it's exactly the reverse. So we're going to see, I don't have a lot to say about Marxist epistemology. Marxist epistemology boils down to an advocacy of a passive mind. a mind which in some processes which they never define, explain, a mind which somehow captures and reproduces the processes in reality. And so they, as we shall see, have very little to say about epistemology, but in metaphysics, they have a lot to say. It's the big deal in Marxism. And what is this metaphysics? Well, the essential claims in metaphysics, in Marxist metaphysics, the essential claim is the rejection of Hegelian idealism in favor of materialism. There's also, very central to Marxist metaphysics, a claim as to what we can prove from the existence of motion. In essence, what we prove is that contradictions exist and underlie everything, which is very compatible with Hegelian dialectics. So now we can move dialectics from the processes that the absolute mind is going through to the processes that matter is going through. And so we look to the material world in a sense as to try and see beneath the appearance or the superficial the appearances underneath to the truth. And while on the surface there appear to be entities of a non-contradictory nature, the truth is that underneath there is a dialectical process unfolding. So consequently, to jump ahead, just to see show you how this leads, if you have a metaphysics like that, then it's not going to occur to you that original thinking is the motive power of human history, let alone the way to achieve humanity. It has to be physical action. And then, having read the Utopian Socialists and Feuerbach, who are all focusing on productive work, being involved in the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, where there is a lot of that physical work going on. And Marx, of course, hates the successful capitalists and the money that they have. Oh, this is easy to translate into a labor theory that ultimately is our laboring activities, which are the crux to history. All right. Well, I just want then to touch on a few points in Marxist metaphysics. First of all, the rejection of Hegelian idealism. Marx is led to the view that idealism, which is the idea that the physical world, this is what idealism essentially says, the physical world, reality, in this sense, is a byproduct or a derivative of the activities of some consciousness. Now, that consciousness can be divine, it can be collective, it can be individual, but it's fundamentally the fountainhead, if you like, of everything we see is some consciousness. So, the more abstract formulation of this view is the primacy of consciousness. The primacy of consciousness view. And on this, Marxism and Objectivism are in agreement. The primacy of consciousness view is false. And there are a lot of things in Marx, and I must say, at some point, so this is a good point to say it, when I was looking into Marx's basic philosophy, and there's several books, I've referred you to some of them in the reading list, to see, okay, what do they say? You find that at the fundamental philosophical level, Engels, in particular in metaphysics, Engels is saying more than Marx is. And Lenin is even saying quite a bit. And so it is not as if Marx laid it all out in this fundamental respect. It is actually a Marxist Engels creation, and Lenin even adds on some more. But it is true, in my opinion, that everything that Engels did, and he had more to say about dialectics in nature than anybody else. Marx looked for the forces of the dialectic in history. And Engels is actually the one that took this further and said that it is not that the forces of the dialectic are just in history, they are everywhere. For example, he'd watch water freezing and would see that in this process it changed from water to ice, which is a fundamental and contradictory, in his view, change. And so, nevertheless, all of this that Engels was doing was done when Marx was alive. Now, Marx was not one to sit still when his associates went off on false tangents. And consequently, it is my view that the fact that he didn't interrupt this train of thought on Hegels' part is definitive to me that Marx is in fact endorsing this viewpoint, which Engels is putting forward up until Marx's death in 1883. Engels then continues to write for another 10 years or so after Marx's death in a vein which I consider to be certainly consistent with, and I even believe approved of, by Marx. So we have the idea, therefore, that it is matter that is fundamental and not mind. Now, the point I want to make is that while idealism is equivalent to the primacy of consciousness, the rejection of idealism does not necessarily imply materialism. It is not true that we need to, if you like, reduce, that we need to have some monist explanation for everything. It is, everything is in the end all in ideas and consciousness, or it is all in matter. And therefore, while objectivism and Marxism reject idealism or the primacy of consciousness, the primacy of existence is not the equivalent of materialism. Primacy of existence is what exists, exists, and doesn't go into details to usurp science and explain, once the scientists get going, ultimately they're going to find these little puffs of energy running around, or like Nietzsche would do. We see so many examples in history of philosophy of philosophers, in a sense, trying to come up with ultimate explanations in terms of one thing. And Marx and Engels are caught up in this. Materialism, the motion of matter, in the form in which this motion takes place, is the key to everything. And I'm saying that on this grounds, objectivism, of course, and Marxism are far apart. So quote 5 it shows Marx and Engels saying, quote, mind itself is merely the highest product of matter. And therefore, we see the materialism of Marx reduces to a kind of a deterministic framework, that in some way everything is caught up in and captured within the motions of matter. Now, just finishing this point, we talk about the primacy of existence and the primacy of consciousness. The word primacy, in regards to the primacy of existence, does not mean existence, brackets, before consciousness came, was the source of everything. That is not what the primacy of existence means. The term, the primacy of existence, the term primacy refers to the function of consciousness. That the function of consciousness is to, in a sense, adhere to or observe the world which is primary. That's the idea. And so we have materialists who have a completely different version of what it would be that primacy would mean, you see. It's more epistemological term, primacy here. It has to do with what the ultimate function of consciousness is. Well, Marx and Engels then were materialists. One of the things that convinced them that not that matter was fundamental, that they're now convinced of, but that if we look at matter, what do we see? What we see is that it moves. I have in my notes here, I made this up, but if I was trying to make up capture my view like Ayn Rand used to do, where Ayn Rand would say to be is to be something specific, with Marx would say to be is to be something moving. That Marx and Engels are all caught up with the idea that matter moves. And in fact, they refer to motion as a form of being, or an inalienable attribute of matter. That it is matter's mode of existence, they say. So, everything that is material, it reduces to motion. Motion is absolute, they say. Rest is relative. Motion is developmental. Motion is developmental. This is not random. There is a process going on. There is this struggle to return. There is a historical story to be found in this motion. And of course, motion, which is fundamental in their view, therefore, it can be seen to interconnect everything else. And so they refer then to, in quote 6, with regards to causality, quote, the first thing that strikes us in considering matter in motion is the interconnection of the individual motions of separate bodies, they're being determined by one another. So we have a perspective in fundamental metaphysics for, in a sense, everything is all part of one process when we get down to it. Now that's easily translatable into you're just part of one social process, and it's the process that's going to be the vehicle through which we achieve humanity, not through you individually. And when you see that and subsume yourself in the species and in the historical process, then divinity will be reachieved. Now, what about everything being in motion? I have a lot of quotes here to show you the depth to which Marx and Engels considered motion a contradiction. And they go right back to Heraclitus. They talk about motion in the same way that confused the earliest Greek philosophers. Quote number 8 captures the point, I think, best. Motion itself is a contradiction. Even simple mechanical change of place can only come about through a body at one and the same moment of time, being both in one place and in another place, being in one and the same place and also not in it. Well, if there is motion, we can't question that. And if motion means that something has to simultaneously be in a place and not be in a place, then what have we discovered? Right there in reality, all around us, contradictions. Contradictions are not, therefore, a warning signal, which they would be to us. They are, in fact, an insight, a deep insight that this is a clue that we're really at the root here. And so they embrace the idea of contradictions as fundamental to everything. Now, as an aside, Harry Binswanger, for the reference if some of you would like it, wrote about this in Volume 2, Number 6 of the Objectivist Forum, December 81. Without going into it in detail, if you take the way these people analyze motion and see what the problem is, what they're saying is, all right, we're trying to get from one place to another. And so we look at a thing which is moving from here to here. And we ask, well, what is here? Let's start with here. And when we examine and focus on whatever it is that is moving, being at some instant of time here, as soon as we get it located there, it isn't moving. So then we have to observe that, according to them, that motion is a contradiction. That we can't have motion if we don't go from here to here, but in order to have us go from here to here, we have to be here, and if we're here, we're not moving. So there is no motion. So consequently, there is motion, but motion then involves the embracing of an idea that you are simultaneously here and not here, a contradiction. Now the problem with that, basically, is that if one looks at concepts and their reference in reality, the whole purpose of concepts being to identify aspects of reality, there is in fact no infinitely small instant of time or infinitely small instance of distance. These are mathematical abstractions, but they do not defer to anything in the real world. And therefore it is an attempt to use an epistemological extension, if you like, which has no referent in actual reality, like infinity as a concept, as an abstraction or a potential, but we would never say anything which exists is infinite. Well, neither is it the case that any infinitely small instance of time or location exists. And consequently, the concepts are not applicable to a body which is moving. A body which is moving is in no place. And the idea of trying to freeze it into some unreal instant which doesn't exist in time is the error. The contradiction is caused by a misapplication of concepts. It's an epistemological error turned into a metaphysical truth. This is primacy of consciousness, by the way. And that is crucial to Marxism. Marx's whole idea of labor as the fundamental activity, I think, reflects his own epistemological processes. This, in fact, is not only true of Marx, it is true throughout the history of philosophy. People make errors with regards to their mental processes, their conceptual hierarchy. They don't understand concepts, and they then misapply them. But boy, if they stick to anything, that's what they end up sticking to. Reality be damned. And if their thinking leads them to certain conclusions, for example, like motion is a contradiction, they're going to stick with that conclusion, and they can write off non-contradictory reality in defense of their conclusions. So that's what they did in essence in this case. Now I've offered you a lot of quotes to show you the presence of contradictions in the Marx and Engels view. So quotes 9, 10, 11 all show you the quotes having to do with the presence of contradiction at the heart of everything according to Marx and Engels. And therefore we see a process whereby contradiction is present everywhere, and it is therefore the truth is that processes are the fundamental activity. So there we have then the presence both of contradictions, but you have to retain with that the idea that these contradictions between A and non-A, which are at the heart of everything, are leading in a developmental direction. That there's some underlying historical saga, if you like, that these laws are contributing to. There is an ultimate end destiny, if you like, to history. So this is the rational kernel, the presence of contradictions. This is the dialectics. It's the rational kernel that they get from Hegel. And they reject what they called the mystical shell, which is Hegel's religion, Hegel's idealism. So this translates into dialectical forces are at work in reality. And in Marx's case, at work in social history, and extended by Engels to at work in all of nature. Consequently, quotes 12, 13, 14, 15, you see Engels going on and on and on, and extending this into the discovery of, at the root of everything, there are the laws of dialectics. The laws of dialectics, which he thinks he finds everywhere, end up, just to give you this, because if you go on and read any Marxism, you might come across this as one of the fundamental perspectives within all of Marxism, the famous three laws of dialectics, which are, first of all, the transformation of quantity into quality. Here we have the idea, and one could apply this to the evolution of species. You get incremental changes, or an obvious example is the bringing together of uranium or whatever they did underneath the stadium in Chicago. And once you got a critical mass together, wham, something happens that wasn't happening before. Now, if you cooled water down incrementally, at some point, wham, something new happens, ice, that hadn't been happening before. So that certain quantitative changes, if added up, will produce eventually a qualitative change. Now this, Marx applies to history. Quantitative changes are going on all the time in capitalism and all the other social eras, but eventually the tension gets to the point. You see how this translates into the dialectics. The tension grows and grows and grows, and then it's the release of the tension that causes the qualitative change to a whole new thing. So the transformation of quantity into quality. The second observation, which is the essence of dialectical perspective to this, is the unity and interpenetration of opposites. That's Hegelian dialectics. So we have, to use these together, a unity and interpenetration. Of unity means they're both together, like over there. And the contradiction between them causes increasing tension. And so we get this interpenetration taking place. This is consistently with the incremental changes of a quantitative nature up to the point where a qualitative change takes place. At which point the third law of the dialectic comes into effect, known as the negation of the negation. Now, this is a mysterious phrase to students until you see what it is saying. It is really two uses of the word negation. To explain this in Hegelian terms, this is capturing the idea of the destruction of, or the transcending of, or the overcoming of objectivity. The overcoming of the idea there is an other outside of the absolute mind. It is the otherness, if you like, and the destruction of the otherness. It captures the idea of the reunification. So what it really means when he says the negation of the negation is that what ultimately happens when these laws have operated to the point where we get from a change of quantity into quality, that nodal point where the tension is released is where some negation has been negated. We'll see how that applies in Marx's view of history tomorrow. So, now with regards to one other point with the Marxist metaphysics, if you take this view over here, of what's fundamentally at the heart of reality, of matter, which is contradictions and motion, and these internal interpenetrating opposites. If you would say, well, what is an entity? What is a tree? What is a person? Essentially. And Marx, led by the what they believe the falseness of the Aristotelian notion that A is A, which they think freezes it arbitrarily and doesn't allow for this. So A is both A and non-A. And so consequently, this leads them to the view that the real underlying truth lies not in entities but in processes, of which the entities are locations. The real importance of entities is they are the location in which this dialectical unfolding process is occurring. And consequently, process and not entity is fundamental to their metaphysics. And consequently, you see quote 19, in spite of all the seeming accidents and of all temporary retrogression, a progressive development asserts itself in the end. This is the great fundamental thought, that processes and involving oneself in processes is fundamental. Now, this ties right in with Marx's total fascination with the processes of work. Because when he turns to analyzing human history and what's happening to us, and how is it we're being alienated, let alone how is it we're going to overcome our alienation, both of these things, we're alienated because we're involved in a particular type of economic process, and we're going to overcome it by a revolutionary process. And so in a sense, it's this idea that processes are fundamental to their metaphysics. That's important. Now, by contrast, in Marxism, there is no great body of material in epistemology. I have been trying to find that I can read. I mean, there's things that have been written which are just undecipherable by neo-Heideggerian Marxists, you imagine. I mean, there's limits to what I demand of myself in order to understand my opponents. And but in straightforward language, what is their theory of ideas? They understand sensory perceptions. They understand how we get perceptions. They automatically wham into us. But they also understand there are ideas. And the ideas are somewhat different, but how? And you look for it, you look for a description of the process, of anything to say about what the human mind is doing, what contribution the human mind is making, and it just isn't there. There are metaphors which suggest to some people that they're not just embracing the idea that all ideas are perceptions. But that's pretty stretched, because they don't offer you any explanation for why ideas aren't perceptions. And it really does boil down to a great extent to the whole Humean view, which is also the view held by Hobbes, that in some way ideas are, if you like, fading images of earlier perceptions, what Hobbes called the higglings and jigglings taking place within the brain by the motions coming from without. Some of you might know that this view led Hobbes, who was concerned with peace throughout his life, to develop his own theory of why he was concerned with peace throughout his life. And it turns out he was born when the British were attacking the Spanish Armada off the coast. And so Hobbes proposed that it was the motions coming from the cannonball shots that impinged on him as a little baby, and that, you know, all the higglings and jigglings from then on, you know, led him to pursue the cause of peace. That's a materialist view. Well, this is essentially what you find in Marx and Engels and Lenin. They do say that we need more than just perceptions. They understand the human mind is at a higher level than the animal mind. For example, quote number 20, where they say, thinking is nothing else than the material world reflected by the human mind. Well, that's a mirror, an image of a mirror there, and translated into forms of thought. Well, when you see that, you think, all right, what's the details on this verb translated? What do they tell us about this translation process? Well, they don't tell you anything. I haven't found anything. I've been looking for it for a long time. And so consequently, it is not at all clear that they have any theory as to what the difference is between perceptions and ideas or concepts. They know there's a connection, but they don't have any to say about what the process is by which we move from the one to the other. And of course, the third great issue in epistemology, that being method, we now know what their view is. Their view is to embrace contradictions and follow the dialectic method. So consequently, their writings on epistemology abound with metaphors such as that perceptions are images of the real world, they are copies of the real world, they are photographs of the real world, they are reflections of the real world, which are essentially passive metaphors. And as to what ideas are, they say such things as that ideas reflect reality, and they say in various places that complicated ideas are, quote, reflexes or, quote, echoes of reality, and also they are, quote, phantoms in the brain. Now that's straight Hobbes. I don't know how many of you have read much of Hobbes' epistemology. It's amazing how Hobbes is a precursor of Hume. You would all think of this as Hume, but it's also Hobbes. Or they are, quote, reproductions in man's mind of earlier perceptions. Now how much is that a help? I mean, ideas are reproductions in your mind of earlier perceptions. You say, oh, that's that enough for you? So that leaves them wide open, you see, to the continuance of this deterministic perspective. They are not offering any role for volition. They are not showing how the human agency is necessary to the development of ideas. Consequently, they would have to have a theory of error. If it's all deterministic, why do some people end up with erroneous views? Well, what's the standard for true versus erroneous? The purposes of history. And who, in a sense, are getting determined, if you like, by the economic circumstances that they're living in to see things correctly, and who is getting determined by the economic circumstances they're living in to be deluded and to be defending the status quo when history is trying to march ahead. Who are the reactionaries? Who are the progressives? All right. So, they quote number 22, the dialectics of the brain is only a reflection of the forms of motion of the real world, both of nature and of history. So, it's deterministic. Thinking is ultimately deterministic. It is a copying activity, and the method that we follow in engaging in our thinking is dialectical, or the embracing of contradictions. So Engels wrote in 1888, 5 years after Marx died, in contrast to Hegel, we, meaning Marx and Engels, this is quote 23, comprehended the concepts in our heads once more materialistically, as images of real things, Thus, dialectics reduced itself to the science of the general laws of motion, both of the external world and of human thought, two sets of laws which are identical in substance. So what is going on in your mind is identical to what is going on in water when we cool it down. It's all a grand monist view, you see. So, it is the case, therefore, within this view, that there both are and are not absolute truths. So, there both are and are not absolutes. Now, you now understand how this could be regarded by Engels and Marx not as a puzzle to be overcome, but as a contradiction to be embraced. To discover that, as they are saying, reality is material. That's not open to negotiation. That's an absolute truth. As far as they're concerned, they never question that. Reality is dialectical, is an absolute truth. That history has a purpose is an absolute truth. But if we get within this, then we find them coming out against rigidity, because they're for processes, against the harsh setting of one thing as against another. The idea that we must guard against absolutes, fixed definitions, absolute truths, moral standards. Their whole view of moral standards is that at least up until the point where we get to communism, which turns out to be the end of history, but at least before then, a moral point of view is just an ideological reflection of your own vested economic interests. So it's all relative to what class you're in and what stage of history you're at. So you see, they have within this view this kind of relativism, this flexibility. And they say, quote 24, really scientific works avoid such dogmatic and moral expressions as error and truth. So, relativism. Now this in part explains why Marx said so little about the communist future that he is pursuing, that he is advocating, that he is claiming we are going to reach. I have some quotes from Marx for you next time on what communism is like, but he had little to say about it, and the answer is that while somebody like Marx, who happens to be on the avant-garde of history and not caught up by ideology and consequently failing to understand what's going on, but there are some people, it turns out, fortunately, can see ahead, and he can see ahead a bit, but until you get there, there's only certain kind of general things can be said in his view as to how things will be organized. If mind is a reflection of matter, you have to get into communist matter before the mind will actually be able to reflect in any detail what is going on. So, he said not too much about communism, and consequently, to advocate communism, if you want to say, well, tell us more about it, it would boil down, in my mind, to, well, for those who know, no explanation is necessary, and for those who don't know, no explanation is possible at this point in time. So, in view of this, then, with regards to his views on epistemology, his views on the mind as a reflection of matter, if you would look to Engels and Marx in terms of what is the fundamental activity going on, what do we have to look at? It is not ideas, it is not philosophy, it is not thinkers, it is economics, it is work. Engels actually said that it was the coming into existence of the opposable thumb that explains the uniqueness of man, because it was with that thumb he began to develop tools. Later, ownership of tools inserts itself, and we move out of the beautiful, golden age of the past when private property rears its ugly head. But it was do you remember the start of the movie 2001, where the ape grabs the bone and all of a sudden figures out it could be used as a weapon or whatever he was doing? Well, there's, you see, there's the Marx and Engels view of what is essential about human life. And so consequently, they look to what they call praxis, or practice, not theory. And they argue for, if you want to ask, well, how can we prove a certain idea to be true? For example, when Engels was asked about Kant's argument that there was a whole noumenal world that we couldn't get in touch with, or the skepticism of David Hume, Engels wrote, quote, this line of reasoning seems undoubtedly hard to beat by mere argumentation. By mere argumentation. So, true, we can't argue against that, but what's arguing got to do with it? Because in the end, he said that the ultimate truth of things is demonstrated through practice. And it is through practice, therefore, that the truth of ideas is demonstrated. So, therefore, if we want to look to history, which is the subject to start with next time, and we want to ask, well, how to explain history? How to approach all of social history? The answer is that we approach it in terms of what kind of praxis are human beings engaging in? What are they doing out there? They're laboring. They are working to produce goods and services to sustain their lives. And therefore, we want to look at the tools that they're using, at the economic relationships they enter into with others, who owns those tools, who doesn't own those tools, who can set the terms of the wage contract, who have to agree to the terms, who are the exploiters, who are the exploited, etc. And that's how all of this feeds into his theory of social history.